All right. So good afternoon, and thank you everyone again for joining us. Welcome to the second iteration during spring 2026 of our Inspiring Peacemakers series. I'm very excited to introduce today's session, focused on multilateral trade and promoting peace, specifically leveraging economic relationships for global stability. My name is Yana Tucker, and I'm a second-year MINT student on the Human Rights and Humanitarianism track. I'm also the co-director of events here at the Student Peacebuilding Initiative. PBI is a student-led organization at the Geneva Graduate Institute that promotes youth participation in peacebuilding efforts and globally oriented discussions. Founded in 2019, the organization now has over 300 active and former members, and is led by a board of 20 individuals as we work to realize our vision of creating a world where collective efforts of youth and young professionals from diverse backgrounds lead to sustainable peace and harmony. The Inspiring Peacemakers series is one of our flagship projects. Through our collaboration with and generous support of the Netherlands Philanthropy Alliance, we aim to connect students with the real-world complexities of peace building through candid, thought-provoking dialogues with high-level peace professionals. Our previous events have brought together ambassadors, trade leaders, mental health professionals, and more, who all provide unique perspectives on how to build peace and address today's most pressing global challenges. Before moving on to the session, I wanted to take one more moment to thank the Netherlands Philanthropy Alliance for their continued support in making the series possible. Now, moving on to today's session. This panel delves into an important question: how can trade and innovation foster sustainable peace? Recently, the Director General of the World Trade Organization, or WTO, Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, described the world trading system as experiencing the worst disruptions of the past 80 years. And the same has been said for the broader multilateral system, as it shifts and responds to geopolitical competition, tensions from tariffs, and an increase in armed conflict. Yet despite this, we still see important international collaboration, and in the economic sphere, a desire to leverage relationships for global stability and peace. This dialogue will cover these important subjects, looking particularly at cross-regional cooperation, intellectual property governance, and trade for peace, with Ambassadors Tan Hun Sen and Mzikusi Kobo from the Republics of Singapore and South Africa, respectively. Singapore and South Africa are both original members of the WTO, and since the organization was founded in 1995, have contributed to its core objectives to govern the rules of trade between countries in order to improve living standards, create better jobs, and promote sustainable development. They further played a core role in the WTO's work facilitating negotiations of trade agreements, managing disputes, and fostering broader collaboration. With that in mind, ambassadors, we look forward to hearing your insights on how this important organization can be leveraged to build peace. I now pass the floor to my colleague Aryan Bajpai, co-director of events with the Peacebuilding Initiative, who will introduce our guests and continue with today's program. Thank you.
Thank you, Yana. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Aryan Bajpai, and I serve as co-director of events for the Peacebuilding Initiative alongside Yana. I'm a second-year student studying a master's degree in international and development studies while specializing in conflict, peace, and security. On behalf of the Peacebuilding Initiative, we are incredibly grateful to have two ambassadors serving as their state's permanent representatives to the WTO here with us today. We are delighted to welcome Ambassador Tan Hun Sen, Ambassador and Permanent Representative of the Republic of Singapore to the WTO and the World Intellectual Property Organization, and Ambassador Mzikusi Kobo, Ambassador and Permanent Representative of the Republic of South Africa to the WTO. I will briefly introduce each ambassador before we begin the discussion portion of this event. Ambassador Tan Hun Sen is the permanent representative of the Republic of Singapore to the WTO and World Intellectual Property Organization since February 2019. He joined the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in 1990 and served as Singapore's permanent representative to ASEAN and ambassador to the Arab Republic of Egypt, with concurrent accreditation to Libya and current accreditation as ambassador to the state of Kuwait. Ambassador Tan's other overseas postings include the Embassy of the Republic of Singapore to Thailand in Bangkok, where he was Deputy Chief of Mission and Counselor from 1999 to 2003, and two stints in Embassy of Republic of Singapore to the Arab Republic of Egypt in Cairo as Deputy Chief of Mission from 2003 to 2005, and first secretary from 1992 to 1995. Ambassador Tan graduated from the National University of Singapore and did postgraduate studies at the School of Oriental and African Studies in the University of London. He was awarded the Public Administration Medal, Silver, in 2011 and the Long Service Medal, in 2013. Dr. Mkisi Gogo is South Africa's ambassador and permanent representative to the WTO in Geneva. He previously headed the Wit School of Governance at the University of the Witwatersrand. Over more than 2 decades, he has worked across government, business, academia, and global governance. Beyond diplomacy, he has advised the World Bank, UNECA, and development agencies, and provided strategic counsel to corporate in the finance, agriculture, and mining sectors. He has served on board of impact funds and development finance institutions with a focus on strengthening governance, delivering social impact, and creating shared value. From 2019 to 2024, he served on President Cyril Ramaphosa's Economic Advisory Council. He holds a PhD from the University of Warwick and holds degrees from Stellenbosch University and the University of Cape Town. He is the author of The Political Economy of China-US Relations, Digital Futures, African Agency. Welcome, ambassadors. We now turn to the discussion portion of the event. Thank you both once again for joining us today. I'd like to begin by looking at the current state of the multilateral trading system and the role of cross-regional collaboration happening despite growing geopolitical and economic uncertainty. As a first question, through a time of change and strain in the multilateral trading system, how is the WTO strengthening participation of states to promote cross-regional trade collaboration? I will now hand the mic to anyone who wishes to answer.
It has to be him because, as you have heard, I am a jack of all trades and master of none, but he is a smarter one.
No.
So, Anzu, you have to go first.
No, thanks, Aksen. I think the questions are spot on at this time. I think we should locate the contribution of the WTO and the value it has today in history. It's often taken for granted that the long period of relative peace we've had was something of a given. And for many of you who've studied history, you remember that the world has had a very dark period, especially in the interwar years, as well as World War II. The institutions that were created post-World War II served to anchor peace. And they've served us well for over 4 decades. And secondly, they have created conditions for commercial flows. Uninterrupted commercial flows led to economic prosperity, prosperity of nations, including developing nations, build confidence for businesses because you have to value the goods that are traded across borders, and also have a ceiling price for goods, for tariffs that are charged on goods. So the multilateral institutions have served mainly 2 purposes. One, to guarantee peace for a very long period of time, and 2, to ensure conditions for economic stability and prosperity. Without these institutions, it's unimaginable what the world would look like. It would be what we saw in the 1930s multiplied, because the world was going one way. The harrowing picture of those periods, the bomb, etc. Now, the WTO serves to ensure that nations trade with one another, but also to sustain those conditions that were created for free movement of goods, low tariff rates, to have a common reference point of the costs of trade. And it has also established a platform for countries to collaborate beyond the WTO. Because if you look at the free trade agreements that have proliferated across the world, these have their reference rules located within the WTO. They have to be notified at the WTO. It's the WTO that provides structure for interpreting what a proper FTA should look like, what substantially all trade should look like. So the WTO is extremely valuable. Yes, it's going under strain, as with many of the multilateral institutions, and these need to be reformed. I don't think we should be complacent about them. They are coming under pressure, and we can talk about some of those specific issues a bit more. Thanks.
Is there anything else that I should add?
Yeah,
Well,
more.
I think you have heard from Zhu the role and the importance of the World Trade Organization. Let me just make 3 points here. The first is that, without a doubt, the WTO and the rules-based multilateral trading system is under tremendous stress. The world that we are living in today is a change world. It's a very different world. We are seeing a series of challenges. It first started with the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, when globalization came under tremendous stress. Instead of focusing on efficiency, the emphasis shifted to resilience, to self-reliance, to friendshoring or onshoring. So the whole premise of the rules-based multilateral trading system, which is based on a global division of labor, of comparative advantage, was shown to have its limitations. And then, of course, you have the Trump administration, Trump 1 and now Trump 2, whereby the fundamental tenets that have underpinned the WTO, like MFN and national treatment, these principles were called into question with the imposition of reciprocal tariffs. So what we are witnessing and experiencing now are real challenges to the rules-based multilateral trading system. So that's a fact. Then the question is, how is the WTO strengthening participation of states in this context? Here, I think we have to understand that the WTO is really a representation of the 166 members that compose it. There is no separate entity known as the WTO. What the WTO is a reflection of the policies, the attitudes, the actions of its 166 members. WTO Director General Ngozi is very fond of saying that or using this analogy of the WTO serving as the plumbing system of a house. Your house or your apartment would be unlivable if you have a faulty or a non-functioning plumbing system. So in that sense, the WTO represents the plumbing system of the multilateral trading system. Yes, MFN has come under stress because of reciprocal tariffs, but we have to keep in mind that about 70% of global trade in goods are still conducted under MFN terms. But more importantly, there are basic and fundamental WTO rules that govern custom valuation, SPS, which underpin the smooth flow of goods on a daily basis, as Zhu has said. So the WTO, the fundamental point here is the WTO is a reflection of its 166 members. And the character of the WTO has changed since its inception in 1995. One, the membership has enlarged. Two, the membership has become more diverse. And three, the relative economic position and influence of members have changed. So, for example, the accession of China, of Russia, of Vietnam have fundamentally changed the dynamics in the WTO. During the GATT era, which I think would be from 1947 after the war to about 1994, GATT was like a club. But since then, the WTO, the character of the WTO has changed fundamentally. And my third and last point is we have to manage our expectations of what the WTO can and cannot do. I like to use the analogy of whether you expect the WTO to be a horse or a cow. The WTO is definitely not a horse. It cannot gallop. Things don't happen quickly in the WTO. But if your expectation of the WTO is that it is a cow still serves a very useful function. It provides us with milk, it provides us with meat. So the fundamental point I want to make here is that we must not have unrealistic expectations of the WTO.
Yeah, I just want to pick up some few points there, which I think were well made. The first is perhaps starting with the second of the 2 points I wanted to pick on. The point is really about the plumbing system. We sometimes take for granted the rules that exist, that have always been there. But if those rules were to be removed, say traffic rules were to be taken away, you start seeing collisions on the road, or accidents, because rules are soft institutions that are often existing behind the scenes. So the plumbing system of the WTO is more or less like that. I mean, the customs valuation, a friend of a good friend, the ambassador of the United Kingdom to the WTO, Ambassador Kuma, likes to use an example of a jacket or a suit. That if there were no clear rules on valuing goods, it would be very difficult to predict what a price of a suit would eventually be that you order. It could be anything, it could be a handbag, it could be any tangible product that you can think of. Because goods cross borders many times before they land in the hand of a consumer. So it is the rules within the WTO that stabilize the conditions for trade, that create predictability for businesses and consumers. So, so we shouldn't take for granted the points that Ambassador Tan made about the plumbing system of the WTO. The second one is this very powerful point about the shift from efficiency to self-reliance or to resilience. I think this is going to define our world for many years to come. We are at that point where textbook economics is turned on its head. What we've learned about market efficiencies, what we've learned about comparative advantage, no longer really apply in real world because many nations are becoming protectionist, and you see that in Europe. Economic nationalism is on the rise. There's a lot of emphasis on national security to justify movement of tariffs or application of high tariffs based on national security considerations, keeping out investments in your certain types of investments in your country, especially in strategic sectors such as AI, high tech, defense, etc. Because these are couched in national security terms. So the borders are no longer as open, or trade is no longer as open as it once was. So the tariff barriers have gone up. Countries are using export controls or export restrictions. They are increasingly using investment screening instruments or mechanisms. And there are multiple choke points that are used menacingly across energy, microchips, rare earths, and other areas where that are expressing propensity for high tech or for dual usage for civilian use and military use. So the world we live in is one of disruptions, and really back to the conclusion that Hansen made is the WTO is faced with a challenge to navigate all of this complexity and to redefine itself anew amidst all these multiple crises. Thanks.
Thank you very much. You both have mentioned that the WTO is a very integral part of the multilateral trading system, and despite challenges, it is one that countries such as the Republic of Singapore and the Republic of South Africa are very adamant on supporting. I wonder then, what are the benefits of multilateral and cross-regional collaboration despite all these challenges? And you have mentioned as well bilateral trade agreements too. What is the benefit in relation to bilateral agreements? Because I know that there are states which have been turning more towards bilateral trading relationships. It is good to know that they do so with the rules of the WTO in mind. However, yes, what are the benefits? I'll pass the mic.
No. Okay. The first point that I want to make is that bilateral and multilateral cooperation, they are not mutually exclusive. In fact, they complement each other. Those of you who have been following trade for some time will know that after the failure of the Doha round, there was a realization that members of the WTO would have to find an alternative way to pursue deepening of economic and trade cooperation. And one way of doing that would be by negotiating bilateral free trade agreements, FTAs. At that time, there were a lot of skeptics, there were a lot of critics who believed that that would lead to the demise of multilateralism. It did not. Bilateral FTAs can flourish side by side with multilateralism. And as you all know, most, in fact, all FTAs are WTO plus. So they add to the multilateral rules that are already in existence. And today, bilateral FTAs have become a fact of life. So we must move away from this misconception that they are mutually exclusive. They are not. And in fact, FTAs can serve as building blocks for multilateral or even regional cooperation. A very good example is the CPTPP. It started as an initiative among 4 small countries: Singapore, Brunei, Chile, New Zealand, and it has since expanded into the CPTPP. So I think that is a very important starting point that we must all keep in mind. Emzu was prompting me to talk a bit about the future of investment and trade partnership, FITP. I don't know if you have heard of it. This is an initiative launched by 4 small, medium-sized countries, namely Singapore, New Zealand, UAE, and Switzerland. So these four countries thought that it would be very important during this challenging juncture to get together and establish a platform among small, medium-sized countries, so that we can, 1, demonstrate that we have agency. We are not at the mercy of the big countries. 2, it can serve as a catalyst, because being a grouping of small and medium-sized countries that are like-minded, we can be more nimble. We can serve as a kind of sandbox to test innovative ideas. So this is another example of it's not regional, because FITP comprises countries from all the regions, from Europe, from Asia, from Africa, Latin America. So this is another example of like-minded countries coming together to cooperate, to collaborate in order to support the rules-based multilateral trading system.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. I share that view fully. There was a time, if you look at some of the literature on trade in the late 90s, early 2000s to mid 2000s, one of the big questions that were asked among trade economists and trade experts was whether FTAs, free trade agreements, are a stepping stone or a stumbling block to multilateralism. So there was this artificial tension that was created back then conceptually. And over time, FTAs have proven to be another essential instrument for promoting trade. Not only trade liberalization of goods, but also to move beyond goods to look into services and new areas in the domain of digital economy frameworks in the domain of green and sustainability and investment relations among countries. So this generate benefits. Of course, multilateralism or multilateral trading system remains very important to set rules systemically and to achieve, to create an environment that allows for symmetric relations in order to save costs of creating rules, you know, at the bilateral or regional levels that could have been created at the multilateral level. So the main function, therefore, is what Hang Seng refers to as WTO plus, going beyond the WTO. There are also other forms of partnerships. He mentioned one where Singapore is involved, VP. Countries also get into all forms of bilateral relations with others that go beyond trade. South Africa, for an example, has a relationship with the EU on top of its participation in Economic Partnership Agreement, and this framework is called the Clean Tech and Investment Partnership City. You know, it's a project valued at over 12 billion euros touching across different elements of green transition, including hydrogen, electric vehicles, integrated battery storage, and other aspects that promote just energy transition in South Africa. But it's useful for the EU to have access to critical minerals as part of bolstering its resilience and industrial competitiveness. We have a similar mechanism with China as part of the China-Africa Economic Partnership Agreement. It seeks to also promote mutual benefit in trade as well as create conditions for economic development for African countries. So these don't go contra the WTO. They don't go contra the spirit of cooperation. If anything, they further promote international cooperation among nations, and they stack up the different networks of economic cooperation across the world.
Wonderful, thank you very much. It is very important to note that, and again repeat that, you know, bilateral and multilateral trade is not mutually exclusive, and that it can encompass so many things, such as including the green transition. These are all very, very important. We've spoken a lot about multilateral cooperation, and I'm wondering if we can turn to how economic relationships, especially multilateral ones, can be used to advance peace, specifically the Trade for Peace agenda. Many scholars have noted how economic interdependence can serve as a stabilizing force on this front. So my first question, more broadly, can trade aid in bringing peace?
Yeah, okay. Well, I mean, in literature, there is this idea of liberal peace thesis. And essentially what it proposes is that the more countries trade together, the more they have a stake in defending their economic gains. That is the economic prosperity created by trade. And conflict raises the transaction costs. It is unlikely that two countries that have high density of trade to enter or to go into violent conflict. Because, I mean, the argument is simple. The more countries trade, the more they create prosperity. And the incentive is to defend that prosperity for their citizens. And there's no appetite in their sovereigns, among their people, to go to war. it does happen from time to time that a democracy goes to war, but the consequences of war, in my view, confirm the validity of the thesis. Because if you look at, say, parts of the Middle East today, the Strait of Hormuz, where there have been sharpening of hostilities, that has reduced the welfare of those countries that are involved in conflict, and it has reduced trade flows and created supply shocks that raise pose threat of inflation. So there are these negative economic externalities that arise as a result of conflict. So the converse is also true. The more countries trade together, the less propensity there is to enter into war. So in my view, that is indisputable. The point really I take forward from that is that international cooperation is the basis of harmonious human relations and is a guarantor of long-term prosperity. I mean, the statistics are all there of how trade has lifted millions of people, hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, especially in Asia. So there's no question about it. So I can only say that, yes, I agree with the assumptions contained in your question. Thanks.
Nothing very much to add to what Zhu has said, except that one, the interdependence that has been created with globalization that has propelled global trade has in recent years become a kind of liability because the interdependence has become over-dependence. And we see that in certain sectors like critical minerals, electric vehicles, solar panels. So while interdependence has worked, I think the pursuit of interdependence and efficiency without guardrails have created in recent years a situation of overdependence, and since the pandemic, that has exacerbated a growing trend of certain countries wanting to do more onshoring or friendshoring, and that in itself has led to what we call trade wars. So does trade aid in bringing peace? I think the answer is both yes and no. It's not a linear relationship, right? It's not a linear progression. So we need to have some nuance to that. And the second point that I want to add is that let's not forget that in the 18th and 19th century, trade was the precursor or the motivator or the impetus for colonialism. You must have all heard that the flag follows trade. And during that time, you had nations who pursue aggressively colonization because they want to expand trade. So when we talk about when you ask the question, can trade aid in bringing peace? we must avoid assuming that it's a linear progression. There are nuances that we need to take into account.
Wonderful, thank you both. Those are very important insights. And I find as well that, you know, there are situations in which trade can undermine peace. Colonialism was brought up, that could be one of them. I'm wondering, is there any way to anticipate and prevent situations where trade can undermine peace? And to add on to this, I've also noted that there are some states who engage in trade who do go to conflict, and they are still trading despite the conflicts going on. So I wonder if you have any thoughts on this.
So thanks. Again, another difficult question. Trade has to be mutually beneficial. Hang Seng is correct that, and if you look at the colonial era type trade, this was extractive, it was
Exploitative.
Exploitative, it was it was asymmetric. So it wasn't quite trade in the sense of interdependence. So it was underdevelopment. Many European countries where they went on a spree to essentially extract natural resources. So I think today we've got to think differently about trade. Trade has to be mutually beneficial, and perhaps start off in the context of the WTO. You've got to create conditions for balance and equity, and to ensure that the trade rules enable the enablers of development, of industrial development, especially those areas that are still lagging behind. It's not only the WTO, it's also what countries do domestically in terms of infrastructure, institutions, governance mechanisms, and putting in place the right conditions to build innovation in their production system. But multilaterally, trade rules should enable the shift up the value chain. The second point is that we've also got to acknowledge that today global production and trade has changed markedly as a result of new technologies, AI, robotics, and automation. So the comparative advantage that you had in yesteryear is no longer prefigured in the same way, because you're not talking, your factors of production are not just labor, land, and capital, but there's a powerful force of robotics, automation, and AI that creates comparative advantage even where it didn't exist. And this can create frictions between countries. And this has to be managed, and the WTO rules are not suited to managing these kinds of trading relationship. And countries, unfortunately, are now retreating behind tariff walls and other protective measures. We've got to discipline against this. We've also got to discipline against any excessive use of subsidies to promote production in ways that could create negative negative effects for other countries, cross-border negative spillovers. How to do this is going to be a big challenge. It's not going to be solved at the WTO only. It will be solved at bilateral level. Countries will have to rethink how they compete in this very difficult environment. And simply put, I don't have the answers. I just can't see how in this world we will be able to equalize the terms of trade. But for developing countries at least, institutions such as the WTO should create rules should enable industrial development. Thanks.
Umzu has already covered very well the international aspect of it. How, I think, let me just focus on the domestic angle, dimension. I think during the time of rapid globalization, which is always associated with free trade. Globalization, we have to acknowledge, has contributed a great deal to improving the general well-being of a huge swath of the global population. But at the same time, it has also exacerbated inequalities within many societies. And here, the approach and responses of national governments are very important. Like my president, Taman, said at the Sangalian Symposium a few years ago, it's important for governments to respond not only by creating safety nets, but creating trampolines, because a trampoline will help to propel the person who is falling down upwards. So that is one aspect that I think has contributed to the negative attitudes towards globalization and free trade globally. And the internal or domestic dimension is equally important.
Thank you very much. At the halfway point of this discussion portion, I will say that the ambassadors are very open to questions during this conversation. We do have a dedicated Q&A period towards the very end. However, if anyone has a very burning question, wave and let us know. Anyone have any questions right now, or to save that to, we'll save that towards the end. All right, thank you very much. So we've discussed how trade can support stability and support peace. The idea of trade then, and what makes trade valuable for societies, it's evolved beyond simply just the trading of goods. It includes knowledge, innovation, creativity, and branding as well, which are important parts of international trade today. I'd like to turn to questions of intellectual property governance and emerging technologies, which was also mentioned. So, given the arising challenges linked to AI and potential unequal access to innovation, and intellectual property becoming increasingly tied to trade and technology, how should the WTO and indeed the WIPO adapt their cooperation?
So thanks. I mean, these are questions, frontier questions, and I think very important, relevant questions. For me, I think we've got to understand that as a starting point, innovation is a driver of national economic progress. It also drives global prosperity. Now, some studies have shown, for an example, that IP-intensive firms, intellectual property-intensive firms, yield far more value than those that don't take IP seriously. And Switzerland is an example of high-intensity IP usage in firms, not just in large firms, but also in small, medium enterprises. And I think in the future, intellectual property is going to be of extreme value to small medium and micro enterprises for several reasons. One is to boost innovation and productivity, to create efficiencies, to create new knowledge assets in these firms, and also taking into account the fact that the emerging army of entrepreneurs, including youth and women-led enterprises in many African countries, in many developing countries, could benefit from IP, because you find content creators, you find those that are in craft. Film industry is growing in many African countries, and new generation content creation. So IP is going to be a vector for development, and also enable greater inclusion as these firms build value on the back of IP as they innovate. But also, I've worked in the space of financing for small and medium enterprises. Access to finance is one of the structural hindrances for many small, micro and medium enterprises in developing countries. Last year we hosted a global summit on SMMEs in South Africa, the first ever. And IP-backed financing is an underutilized instrument by small and medium enterprises. And this requires, to some degree, a shift in paradigm in commercial banks that interface with businesses, in development finance institutions, as well as incubators and development partners to small and medium enterprises. So that's a domain of opportunity. There's also a domain of challenges in protecting intellectual property. But we can talk about that. I don't want to hold on to the mic for long. Let me pass on to Hang Seng.
Just to add that, or to pick up from where you have left off, that we need a paradigm shift when we think about intellectual property. I think for the longest time, intellectual property has been seen as an issue of protection of intellectual property rights. It's about regulation, it's about protection. Yes, those are important elements, but as Emzu has said, increasingly intellectual property must be seen as an enabler of economic growth. Intellectual property is fundamentally about innovation, because what are you protecting? You're protecting new ideas. So there has to be a paradigm shift, and that paradigm shift must be accompanied by a mindset change that moves away from seeing intellectual property as a north-south issue. For too long, developing countries many developing countries have seen or have regarded intellectual property rights, intellectual property protection as a means for the developed countries to gain an unfair advantage over them. That has to go, because increasingly the emphasis of intellectual property must move to what you have said, commercialization of intellectual property. How can MSMEs use intellectual property, for example, as collaterals? To go to a bank and say that, look, I have the IP right for this, I want to use it as a collateral to take a loan. So So these are new areas that need to develop, and these are the new areas that I think offer the most promise for the future.
Yeah, I mean, maybe to add, just on two things. One is that I do think we should transcend this binary divide, north and south. There is a place for protecting knowledge, no doubt, because protection incentivizes the innovators to take risk. It's what fuels, or rather, it's one of the critical components that fuel entrepreneurial risk, because it will generate the rents for innovators. And you see this also in the shifts in or transformation of, in copyright protection in the US, with the introduction of fair use. Unlike the assumptions we tend to make, it was mostly big tech companies that wanted a much less copyright protection from the content created by content creators, simply because the content is an input, it's a cost. So they didn't want to, to have to pay that cost. Is it therefore important for content creators that their content is protected? If you're a content creator, you will say yes. So some big tech firms have created partnership models that seek to equalize, the benefits without getting into merit as to whether those are fair or not. But there has been a recognition that in some ways you need to reward knowledge or innovation, etc. Forget about north-south. Many creators in traditional communities want their products or their knowledge to be protected. Is intellectual property protection a bad or a good thing? So you can't say it's a bad thing. So it's how it's used and what it seeks to achieve. But it's fundamentally about the point you make, to view it more as an enabler and as a critical instrument to further innovation, not to limit, not to restrict innovation. Does protection of one form or another hinder or promote innovation? And finally, today we've got to think about intellectual property as part of a dynamic ecosystem. Small, medium, micro enterprises have to work closely with big firms, with governments, with DFIs, with commercial banks, to advance their innovations, and protection of IP is going to be important there. Knowledge institutions have a far more important role to play, because there's a lot of innovation that happens in universities. So IP management, how IP is managed, how IP is commercialized, and how IP is further transferred to create positive spillovers in society is also going to be very, 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 very important. So it's a paradigm issue. It's about thinking more in terms of innovation, in terms of progressing the role of IP in the national innovation systems and in promoting economic development in societies. Thanks.
And just a quick point, because you had asked also about the nexus between artificial intelligence and intellectual property. Suffice to say that this is still a very nascent issue. Both the WTO and WIPO have just begun their respective journeys on how to address the challenges as well as opportunities posed by the emergence of artificial intelligence. One very simple example is the question of whether a piece of music or a piece of art that is generated by AI, does that qualify for IP protection? Copyright? At the moment, the laws or the rules say no, but that may change. So this is an area that is still very exploratory for both the WTO and WIPO. For WTO, the impact is really seen in the area of supply chain resilience, because AI can have a tremendous impact on supply chain.
Yeah, maybe just to add very quickly there, on the, especially on the new domains of AI and copyrights, because increasingly, because those big tech, and here I'm not attacking big tech, because they have added a lot of value in how we build efficiencies in corporates, how we approach teaching and learning at universities, and how we manage multiple tasks, either in our personal lives or in our professional lives, socially or commercially. But they tap, or they rely on data sets to train their models. They rely on data sets, and these data sets are scraped off internet, so they don't come from the ether. So this is aggregation of works that already exist. And how then do we compensate some of the original creators of that work? And are we able to disaggregate what belongs to whom? I mean, there's been more recently, I think, a big case, for those who have not followed it. I think it was in London. One of the authors is a South African, Zakes Mda. But it's thousands of authors whose work were used in training models without attribution. And I think it was found in their favor. I mean, I can't recall now the specific details of the case, and I don't want to mention the companies, and I get it wrong. But it's a fascinating case on copyrights and the use of information data scraped off the internet by model trainers. And we are going to see a lot more of this in the domain of copyrights, in the domain of patents, in the domain of trademarks. And it's a challenge for you who are in institutions of higher learning to help us think about what future regulation looks like in this area. And I suspect that there's going to be a lot of sandboxing. Part of the answers already lie in this idea of transformation of knowledge and how you determine fair use, which has been used quite a lot in the US, but not universally. Yeah, it's a very fascinating area. We'll see how it evolves in the future.
Thank you very much. And one more brief question in this section. I was wondering, so in an increasingly fragmented world, how can institutions like the WTO use IP governance to strengthen peace-building sectors specifically? Is there any relation between intellectual property and perhaps peace agreements?
No idea.
I think, okay, I was thinking AI, IP and peace agreements.
AI.
Yeah, I mean, with AI, it's a ubiquitous technology now, and I'm sure that it's going to help a great deal at the basic really, in putting together decent peace agreements. Because I mean, here we talk about large language models. I mean, you already see certain uniformity in the structuring of language or writing a certain document. I mean, I sometimes listen in the WTO, there's certain stock phrases that you realize that this comes from AI in how, say, statements are read. So already I think there's a certain level of reliance on AI. It does have its own dangers because there's still problems of hallucination. So here you still need very good prompt engineering. You need excellent human judgment. You need excellent negotiators and rapporteurs, etc. So AI is never going to replace those, but it can be a critical instrument to put together, decent frameworks for peace agreements or to prompt for approaches to negotiating a peace settlement. I mean, these are things that lie, in the horizon, and I can think of multiple other uses of AI. In terms of IP, I'm not sure, I've not thought of the relationship between IP and peace and security. All I can say is that I think we've got to shift away from the traditional approaches to settling IP conflicts. I mean, these were, there were a lot of them. If you read the history of the evolution of digital electronics, especially in the 70s and the 80s, Japan and the US. So much of patent case law in digital electronics is in the US. And I'm not so sure today if we can approach patents in the way that they were approached, sort of patent disputes the way they were approached back then. But there's also the challenge of having to train many examiners, patent examiners, who are steeped or at least have a good grasp of dynamics of AI today. So that has to be incorporated into patent examination increasingly. Thanks.
Sean? Nothing to add.
No worries, thank you very much. Okay, before we open the floor to Q&A from the audience, I know many students and young professionals in the crowd today are interested in careers that might interact with the multilateral trading system or the policy sector more broadly. For this last section, I would like to ask questions about your professional journeys, and if you have advice for students and young professionals. Of course, we are a peace building initiative, so to tie it to peace building would be amazing as well. To start, what core values and specific interests have thus far guided your professional journeys?
I would suggest three things. First, always take principled positions because it's easier to defend principles. And when you take principled positions, you provide to your interlocutors a certain level of consistency and predictability, which is valued. Second is to be creative and innovative in terms of creating value for yourself, especially coming from a small country like Singapore. We constantly have to think of ways to add value to the system, to the world. As our founding Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew famously said, Singapore is so small that even if we were to disappear from the map tomorrow, no one is going to miss us. And that is, I think, a very realistic assessment. And for the diplomat representing a small country like Singapore, we must always be conscious of that fact and be innovative and creative, and thinking of ways to create value for Singapore and for ourselves. And the third core value that I would like to leave with you is really honesty. You often hear that diplomats are paid to lie for their countries. That is as far from the truth as it can be. Because if you engage in lies, in falsehoods, you cannot keep up that game or that facade for very long. You'll be exposed in no time. Like they say, you can fool some people all the time. You can fool most people some of the time, but you cannot fool everybody all the time. So honesty is a premium, and in the course of my almost 40 years of diplomatic service, I find that honesty is always a value premium for your interlocutors.
So thanks, I think they're pretty much the same. I would say be ethical, live ethically, and think ethically. Have a guiding moral compass that you embrace. That for me has been a foundation. That is not to say I'm perfect. But aspire to an ethical framework that guides you, because this is what takes you far in life, and I mean this is part of also of character building. There are many people. What I think has sustained me in many instances is to know that in the world there are smarter people than I am. And there will be many smarter people than I am. I cannot compete on the basis of smartness. I can compete on the basis of character. I have to pursue excellence, and that includes following an ethical framework. The second one is I try to be brutal about my pursuit of growth. I pursue growth. I want to grow, I want to learn. I read a lot. I read not as much as many other people read, but I read diverse literature, from literature itself, English literature, novels, especially that have moral stories, classics. I read history, I read diverse biography, I try to read science when I can. I read about personal development. So I am hungry for knowledge. I want to read. I spend time reading and thinking. Third, I think it's be ambitious. Ambitious for yourself and ambitious for your society. Have a mission that goes beyond your material goals or your survival needs. Pursue self-actualization by seeking to do good in the world and leaving an imprint. And this will require you to be true to yourself. Those for me are three most important things. As to how I chose career paths, there was no linear path. I didn't know 10 years, 5 years ago, or even 3 years before, or a year before my posting, that I'll be ambassador in Geneva. I was planning a different career as an academic. Many of the things I got to do were unplanned, but I always set goals. And when I look back, I've always achieved more than the goals I set, which means that goal setting is important, even though you don't land at where you desired, you always land at somewhere better.
Wonderful, thank you both. Those are very, very incisive insights that I think we will take with us. I'm wondering just one more thing before we turn the floor to the audience. Would you have any concluding remarks on this whole discussion? We've had a very good discussion that's gone from so many topics, cross-border and cross-regional collaboration, trade for peace, IP governance, and advice. Do you have any final thoughts?
Keep faith in multilateralism.
Say that again.
Keep faith in multilateralism.
Yeah. International cooperation is the basis for understanding and sustaining peace and prosperity. There is no alternative.
Wonderful, thank you both very much. And now we can turn the floor to the audience. I would like to open the floor. We will not use the microphone in the audience, so please project your voice. If you have a question, please raise your hand. I see one right in front.
Yes, thank you for your presentation. It was very insightful, and I think you touched upon many different and very important points, but I have a bit of a critical question maybe, because I'm reflecting a lot on the EU as a multilateral system in some ways, and I mean, while it was founded because through trade and economic cooperation to ensure peace over a long period of time, I'm sometimes wondering how, and maybe you also deal with that in your career, how then this union that developed through the goal of having long-term peace now does bilateral agreements, for example, with Northern African states or different countries, where the goal is again economic cooperation and mutual growth, but it still creates a system where it's very much still unequal who profits from the cooperation. Like I'm thinking, for example, with the EU Pact on migration, with Tunisia and the Memorandum of Understanding there, where the political elites for sure profit, and it's a very much profitable also cooperation from the EU perspective, with like fuel and economic cooperation and also migration control, which is a very big point. But I'm wondering how this very peaceful union is a lot of the times not doing so much peaceful or really honest agreements with other countries. And I mean, while I'm still very much in favor, of course, of the union and the multilateral system, I'm wondering what your perspective on these also unequal values that are sometimes transferred is. Like you mentioned, the values are so important.
Yeah, not an easy question, and I mean, I don't profess to have all the answers, but one thing I would say is this: yes, the world is unequal.
Yeah.
The multilateral system is imperfect, and this really is a reflection of the diverse human nature. And our task today is to strive for excellence. That is to ensure that these institutions are reformed, they are retooled, and that they renew their purpose. Yes, they achieve the goals that they were intended to achieve. So we've got to push for that. We've got to have a multi-generational vision of them, because we want to bequeath something to the future generation. And that's going to happen through institutional renewal and renewal of societies. Now, we're never going to have a perfect world. We're never going to have a world where everyone is equal. That's very sad. But we've got to see progress. And we've seen that with the era of globalization, where hundreds of millions of people were taken out of poverty. Yes, there are losers and winners. We've got to take care of the losers. We've got to forge solidarity. We've got to convince each other that a world where the gains of peace, the peace dividend, the gains of trade are shared abroad is better for everyone, because it reduces the propensity for conflicts and for tensions. So I'm quite hopeful about the future, as imperfect as the present is.
Totally agree with you that, perfect equality is an ideal which unfortunately does not exist in the real world. Going back to your example of what you think are imbalanced agreements between the EU and say some of the North African countries, the Maghreb countries, I think in any negotiation, there is almost impossible to have equal parity, perfect parity. That means I gain 50%, you gain 50%. I don't think that is achievable in real life negotiations. In real life negotiations, the art of negotiation is to really make sure that both sides walk away equally unhappy. Right? So if both sides can feel that, okay, I gained some, you have gained some, on balance, I am better off, then an agreement is struck. And I think the fact that the EU negotiates is far better than the EU saying that I come from a position of strength, I impose unilateral measures against you. So I think it is what it is. The world is an imperfect world. I think we all have to be what I would call cynical idealists. We can be idealists, but at the same time we have to balance that with a healthy dose of cynicism or realism.
Yeah, I quite like the kind of phrase there, cynical idealist. When you, in the practice of diplomacy, everything you knew about what diplomacy is like is thrown out of the window. The reality is completely different. And you can't have an all or nothing, 1, 2. You can't have perfect outcomes between the interplays of power are real. The interplays of power are real. And it's about taking position inch by inch. It's about relative gains rather than absolute gains. I mean, we may not like to say this publicly, but that's what you're going to have. If you are radical, you want all or nothing. Of course, you don't start off from a position of compromise. You set your ambition high, but you know that if you are to have an agreement, it's not going to be what you want. You're going to walk away offended, unhappy, dejected, thinking this is the worst thing you've done. But in time, when you look back, you'll be quite pleased. Maybe not, but you would have gained something than nothing.
Wonderful, thank you. I see a question here.
Yeah, thank you for the presentations. They were quite insightful. I don't know if you can hear me. I think at the beginning you started talking about the multilateral institutions being created post the Second World War to support the peace building process, which we have had for a long time. And the WTO was part of it. So now when we look back, and there are some studies that are done by the World Bank, and I think USA before it was dismantled, it talks about the percentage of the poorest. About 60% of the poorest are supposed to be living in fragile and conflict-affected states. And now we are also experiencing the highest level of conflict ever since the Second World War. So my question to you, and you'll see how to go about it. I understand that the WTO is going through this reform talk, and there are a lot of conversations about what it means for the members and all of that. But in any of the talks, I don't think there's any specific agenda on how the WTO is actually going to be an instrument in the current context of conflict. Because I think the WTO was created post-conflict to continue the stabilization, but now we are going into conflict. And I see similar, I would say similar institutions because they were created under the Bretton Woods, so IMF, World Bank, they're all adapting the FCS strategy, they're all like funding with that conflict perspective. And I wanted to know from you as the members, given the WTO is a reflection, how would you go about it? What would it look like using the WTO as a tool to support either peace talks or peace building or prevention? And I know the speaker, the moderator kept on talking about trade for peace agenda, trade for peace agenda. And there is a trade for peace program at the WTO in the accessions division, so supporting all of the countries that are trying to accede, that have faced the conflict. But there isn't that talk about members that are either in conflict or just post-conflict. You can talk Yemen, Afghanistan. You don't even have to talk about the big ones. Mozambique, DRC. If you were just now going back to the conversation of regional agreements, if you were to draft an FTA as a member, what would you ideally come up to support peace building in those countries? So those are my two questions.
You are the smart one. You answer.
Okay, I'll start off by being really flat and say, and maybe disappoint you that the WTO has limits.
Mhm.
It will not be able to do much of what you've articulated. It doesn't mean it can't play a role, but the role it can play is very minimal. And I'll say just in a minute where I think possibilities for impact lie. Now, I think we also have to think in terms of sequencing now at the national level, as well as in terms of the FTAs, especially the North-South FTAs that may touch upon fragile economies or in regions where fragile economies, although you have very few of such FTAs. So FTAs could act as an anchor to prevent reversal to conflict situations or to state of fragility. The WTO does have capacity building programs, but that's just about that. It's not going to overcome conflict induced fragility. It's just going to be very, very difficult. Where the opportunities lie is in strengthened collaboration among multilateral institutions to build synergies and to draw resources across for work at the nexus of peace and trade. I mean, when I say multilateral institutions, I'm talking about the WTO, the UN agencies, UITC, which tends to work in many developing countries, including fragile countries, World Bank, and UNCTAD, which is a knowledge resource. The enhanced integrated framework. So you could have programs that are specifically aimed at bolstering capabilities in fragile economies as an outcome of integrated collaboration among multiple multilateral institutions. I think this is possible. I'm not saying it's going to erase the ugly scars of conflict and fragility, but it can go somewhere in building capabilities or reinforcing capabilities in those countries. But I have to be clear, the WTO on its own will not be able to do that.
Totally agree with what you have said, Zhu. I think going back to my analogy, I think we have to keep in mind that the WTO is a cow, it's not a horse. So we must manage our expectations. The short answer is, can the WTO prevent conflict? Can the WTO help conflict-ridden countries or regions? The short answer is no. The WTO was never designed for that purpose. The Bretton Woods system, as you have said, was designed post Second World War in an attempt to create conditions that will avoid or prevent conflict. The United Nations, especially the UN Security Council, was specifically mandated for that purpose. And as we have seen, it has failed. Why? Partly it's the structural design of the system, but more fundamentally it's because countries, nation states, have very different interests. They behave in certain ways, and while the multilateral system, including the UN, the Bretton Woods system, can act as, I wouldn't even call them brakes, but although they can contribute to some extent to de-escalation, reducing tension, I think we will just have to accept that conflict is part and parcel of the international system. It's systemic. That may be a rather cynical view, but I think it's quite an accurate reflection of the reality.
Thank you. I see a question here, yeah?
I just had, thank you so much for the sharing, it was really insightful. I'll try to keep my question quick. I was thinking about how since 2020, Trump has blocked the appointment of judges to the WTO. And I think when we think about how do we create trade, how do we sustain things in the long run, we think a lot about creating the right institutions to do this. But to me, this is a deliberate failure of the institution. And because of that, especially in current times when trade is not in the best situation and there's so much pressure on the system, I'm just thinking firstly, like, how do you think WTO continues to retain its value even with such failures of institutions? And secondly, as as people representing countries which might not have the same economic horsepower as like the US, how do you think we can navigate such situations and manage this?
Yeah, just perhaps pointed to your question. I think it's unfortunate that the appointments to the appellate body have continued to be, to be objected, to be blocked, because the dispute settlement system of the WTO plays a really fundamental role in protecting global trade flows on legally secured basis. It gives predictability to exporters, small, medium enterprises, big firms. So we used to call it the crown jewel of the WTO. So that situation is very unfortunate. It disfigured a very important pillar of the WTO at its creation, because the dispute settlement mechanism was one of those, trade policy review mechanism was another institutional innovation, and of course the platform for multilateral trade negotiations, as well as other several pillars. Will it come back? We don't know. No one can give you a response to that answer. Another good friend, ambassador of Barbados, Matthew Wilson, made this point at a different meeting, that the WTO also has to realize an identity as a dynamic ecosystem to deal with a multiplicity of new challenges, of new issues that are related to trade. For an example, on SMMEs, on women in trade, creating a deliberative platform to think about how trade in the future would look like. But the sort of trade arrangements where there is hard law, I think it's kind of ebbing away. The sort of a WTO that is based on hard law, we've seen that has been shaken, but that shouldn't spell the collapse of the WTO. I think the WTO should be dynamic, it should evolve in different ways, and it should stay relevant. So the dynamism shouldn't run away from its core purpose. It should be dynamic around its core purpose, realizing that the terrain, the landscape of trade has changed quite markedly in the past couple of years.
First, I can be more definitive than you are. I think quite certainly we will not see the revitalization of the appellate body. I don't see that being revived in the foreseeable future. Second, does that spell gloom and doom for the WTO? I agree with you, it doesn't, because the WTO is fundamentally more than just the dispute settlement system. It was a very important element of the WTO architecture, but it certainly would not be like the cornerstone. When you take away that cornerstone, the building collapses. I don't think it is that. And third, in response to the paralysis of the appellate body, a group of 56 members have signed on to what is called the MPIA, the Multi-Party Interim Arbitration Arrangement. Basically, what this MPIA does is that it leverages on Article 25 of the Marrakesh Agreement, which provides for arbitration. So members, because the dispute settlement system is still functioning, if you and I have a dispute, we can still file a dispute. You can form a panel, and panels have been formed since 2020. The only difference here is that instead of appealing to the appellate body, members who are part of the MPIA or even non-members can use the MPIA as a second tier, and that would be done by arbitration, and the outcome would also be binding. So recently, the European Union and Turkey is not a member of the MPIA, but both parties, after the dispute panel issued its report, both of them agreed to submit it to the MPIA for our arbitration. So in a way, it's still functioning. It's, I would say, suboptimal, but it is not the end, as you have said, of the WTO.
Yeah, just a quick addition to the point, some of the points. I mean, I agree with Hang Seng. Some of the points I was making. I mean, there are areas the WTO is very slow to respond to, which are very critical for global commerce, on digital trade, the domain of digital trade. Even if it's to explore what future regulation could look like, or rulemaking rather. Or cooperation in this area, or how trade in this area is evolving. AI and trade is another area where we are not very quick in moving, as well as the relationship between global value chains, investment, and trade. So there are many dimensions of economic life that the WTO can be responsive to in ways that captures or seizes the imagination of businesses across different levels, SMMEs and large firms.
Thank you very much. Are there any other burning questions from the audience? No? All right, well, thank you. That is then, unfortunately, all the time that we have available for questions, though we encourage you to continue the discussion in our apéro taking place right after this event. I have so many insights from this incredible conversation. To believe in multilateralism, that trade can aid in bringing peace. And I have so much more written down. I'm sure many of the audience members could say the same. So we encourage you to take these insights forward into your studies and your careers, especially if you are finding yourselves working in a field or sector which interacts with the multilateral trading system. On behalf of the Peace Building Initiative, I would like to take this opportunity now to thank Ambassador Tan and Ambassador Kogo for their time and their incredibly important remarks. Could we get a round of applause?
Thank you, all of you, for your patience.
Thanks to you.
Thank you, and I would also like to extend a thank you to the Nagalandran Philanthropy Alliance for their generous support and partnership for the Inspiring Peacemaker series, and thank the FAB here at the Geneva Graduate Institute for hosting us. We would now like to invite our guests and participants to the apéro portion of the event to connect with one another and to help yourselves to the food and drinks which are at the back of the room. Thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you, ambassadors,
Thank you.
and we wish you a wonderful evening. Thank you.
Thank you.